Jawaharlal Nehru, The Search for India. Though books and old monuments and past cultural achievements helped to produce some understanding of India, they did not satisfy me or give me the answer I was looking for. Nor could they, for they dealt with the past age, and I wanted to know if there was any real connection between that past and the present. The present for me and for many others like me was an odd mixture of medievalism, appalling poverty and misery, and a somewhat superficial modernism of the middle classes. I was not an admirer of my own class or kind, and yet inevitably I looked to it for leadership in the struggle for India's salvation. That middle class felt caged and circumcised and wanted to grow and develop itself. Unable to do so within the framework of British rule, a spirit of revolt grew against this rule, and yet this spirit was not directed against the structure that crossed us. It sought to retain it and control it by displacing the British. These middle classes were too much the product of that structure to challenge it and seek to uproot it. New forces arose that drove us to the masses in the villages, and for the first time a new and different India rose up before the young intellectuals who had almost forgotten its existence or attached little importance to it. It was a disturbing sight, not only because of its stark misery and the magnitude of its problems, but because it began to upset some of our values and conclusions. So began for us the discovery of India as it was, and it produced both understanding and conflict within us. Our reactions varied and dependent on our previous environment and experience. Some were already sufficiently acquainted with these village masses not to experience any new sensation. They took them for granted. But for me, it was a real voice of discovery, and while I was always painfully conscious of the failings and weaknesses of my people, I found in India's country folk something different to define which attracted me. That's something I had missed in our middle classes. I do not idealize the conception of the masses, and as far as possible, I try to avoid thinking of them as a theoretical abstraction. The people of India are very real to me in their great variety and in spite of their vast numbers. I try to think of them as individuals rather than as a vague groups. Perhaps it was because I did not expect much from them that I was not disappointed. I found more than I had expected. It struck me that perhaps the reason for this and for a certain stability and potential strength that they possessed was the old Indian cultural tradition which was still retained by them in a small measure. Much had gone in the battering they had received during the past 200 years, yet something remained that was worthwhile, and with it so much that was worthless and evil. During the 20s, my work was largely confined to my own province, and I traveled extensively and intensively through the towns and villages of the 48 districts of the United Provinces of Agra and Oudh, that heart of Hindustan as it has so long been considered the seat and center of both ancient and medieval civilization, the melting pot of so many races and cultures, the area where the great revolt of 1857 blazed up and was later ruthlessly crushed. I grew to know that sturdy jet of the northern and western districts, the typical son of the soil, brave and independent, looking relatively more prosperous, the Rajput peasant and petty landholder. Still proud of his race and ancestry, even though he might have changed his faith and adopted Islam, the depth and skillful artisans and cottage workers, both Hindu and Muslims, the poorer peasantry and tenants in their vast number, especially in Oudh and the eastern districts, crushed and ground down by generations of oppression and poverty, hardly daring to hope that a change would come to better their lot, and yet hoping and full of faith. During the 30s, in the intervals of my life out of prison, and especially during the election campaign of 1936 to 37, I traveled more extensively throughout India, in towns and cities and villages alike. Except for rural Bengal, which unhappily I have only rarely visited, I toured in every province and went deep into villages. I spoke of political and economic issues, and judging from my speech, I was full of politics and elections. But all of this while, in a corner of my mind, lay something deeper and more vivid, and elections or the other excitements of the passing day meant little to it. Another and a major excitement had seized me, and I was again on a great voyage of discovery, and the land of India and the people of India lay spread out before me. India, with all her infinite charm and variety, began to grow upon me more and more, and yet the more I saw of her, the more I realized how very difficult it was for me or for anyone else to grasp the ideas she had embodied. It was not her wide spaces that eluded me, or even her diversity, but some depth of soul which I could not fathom, though I had occasional and tantalizing glimpses of it. She was like some ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed, and yet so succeeding layer had completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. All of these existed in our conscious or subconscious sleeps, though we may not have been aware of them, and they had gone to build up the complex and mysterious personality of India. The Sphinx like face with its elusive and sometimes mocking smile was to seen throughout the length and breadth of the land. Though outwardly there was diversity and infinite variety among our people everywhere, there was that tremendous impress of oneness which had held all of us together for ages past, whatever political fate or misfortune had befallen us. The unity of India was no longer merely an intellectual conception for me. It was an emotional experience which overpowered me. That essential unity had been so powerful that no political division, no disaster or catastrophe had been able to overcome it. It was absurd, of course, to think of India and any country as a kind of anthrop- anthropom sorry anthropomorphic entity. I did not do so. I was also fully aware of these diversities and divisions of Indian life, of classes, castes, religions, races, different degrees of cultural development. Yet I think that a country with a long cultural background and a common outlook on life develops a spirit that is peculiar to it and that is impressed on all its children, however much they may differ among themselves. Can anyone fail to see this in China, whether he meets an old-fashioned Mandarin or a communist who has apparently broken with the past? It was the spirit of India that I was after, not through idle curiosity, through I was to the understanding of my country and people, some guidance to thought and action. Politics and election were day-to-day affairs when we grew excited over trumpery matters. But if we were going to build the house of India's future strong and secure and beautiful, we would have to dig deep for foundations. Bharat Mata. Often, as I wandered from meeting to meeting, I spoke to my audience of this India of ours, of Hindustan and of Bharata, the old Sanskrit name derived from the mythical founder of the race, seldom did so in the cities. For there, the audiences were more sophisticated and wanted stronger fare. But to the peasant with his limited outlook, I spoke of his great country for whose freedom we were struggling, of how each part differed from the other. And yet, was India of common problems of the peasants from north to south and east to west, of the swaras that could only be for all and every part and not for some. I told them of my journey from the Kavir Pass in the far northwest to Kanyakumari or Cape Comorin in the distant south, and how everywhere the peasants put me identical questions, for their troubles were the same: poverty, debt, vested interests, landlords, moneylenders, heavy rents and taxes, police harassment, and all these wrapped up in the structure that the foreign government had imposed upon us, and relief must also come for all. I tried to make them think of India as a whole, and even to some little extent of this wide world of which we were a part. I brought in a struggle in China, in Spain, in Abyssinia, in Central Europe, in Egypt, and the countries of Western Asia. I told them of the wonderful changes in the Soviet Union and of the great progress made in America. The task was not easy, yet it was not so difficult as I had imagined, for our ancient epics and myths, the legends, which they knew so well, had made them familiar with the conception of their country, and some there were always who had travelled far and wide the great places of pilgrimage situated at the four corners of India. Or there were old soldiers who had served in foreign parts in World War I or other expeditions. Even my references of foreign countries were brought home to them by the consequences of the Great Depression of the 30s. Sometimes, as I reached a gathering, a great roar of welcome would greet me. Bharat Mata ki Jai, victory to Mother India. I would ask them unexpectedly what they meant by the cry, who was this Bharat Mata, Mother India, whose victory they wanted. My question would amuse them and surprise them, and then, not knowing exactly what to answer, they would look at each other and at me. I persisted in my questioning. At last, the vigorous Jat, weeded to the soil from immemorial generation, would say that it was the dharti, the good earth of India, that they meant. What earth? Their particular village patch, or all the patches in the districts or province, or in the whole of India? And so question and answer went on till they would ask me impatiently to tell them all about it. I endeavored to do so and explain that India was all this that they had thought, but it was much more. The mountains and the rivers of India, and the forests and the broad fields which gave us food, were all dear to us. But what counted ultimately were the people of India, people like them and me, who were spread out all over the vast land. Bharat Mata, Mother India, was essentially these millions of people, and victory to her meant victory of these people. You are parts of this Bharat Mata. I told them, you are in a manner yourselves Bharat Mata, and as this idea slowly soaked into their brains, their eyes would light up as if they had made a great discovery.